Good afternoon and welcome to CUSP Research Series with me. I'm Antto Vihma. I work here at FIIA as a research professor, and we have an honorable guest today. We're very happy to have Dr. Stephen Livingston with us. He's professor of media and public affairs at George Washington University and founding director of Institute for Data, Democracy and Politics at George Washington University as well. Professor Livingston has studied these issues that we're going to be talking about today for a long period of time. We're going to be touching upon social media, polarization, democracy, big issues. And he also has a pretty recent, super interesting edited volume out called The Disinformation Age, 2019, from Cambridge University Press, if I'm not mistaken. Without further ado, I present Dr. Stephen Livingston.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. This is such a privilege and a pleasure, and I look forward to our conversation. Thanks to the Finnish Institute of International Affairs for giving me this opportunity. I need to add that my co-editor on the book, The Disinformation Age, is Lance Bennett from the University of Washington, and that book was supported by the Social Science Research Council in New York. You're absolutely right. What brings me here to Finland as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Helsinki is this interest in the relationship between social media platforms, polarization, public polarization that has the tendency of pulling people apart, as is the case in my own country, in the United States, where the political dialogue is so polarized, we're often not even understanding what the nature of the problem is in the first place, much less disagreeing about the solution. So in a sense, the reason that I'm here in Finland is to really have an opportunity to spend time looking at the question, what causes polarization? Why are not just, the United States, why are other countries also experiencing this polarization effect? Here's the supposition that polarization leads to threats to liberal democracy. Polarized societies end up through frustration, through ambivalence in terms of dedication to even democracy in the first place, end up slipping into what is sometimes called illiberal democracy or competitive authoritarianism. There are a number of terms that are applied to this, but basically the idea is that highly polarized societies do not fare well when it comes to maintaining liberal democracy. To get a sense of that, I thought perhaps we could begin by just my reaching here and giving you something of a summary of where we are at this point in time. According to Freedom House, which is a research institute in Washington, D.C., there are more liberal democracies under duress in 2021 than at any other time since tracking began in 2006. Similar trends were found by VDEM, a democracy research institute in Sweden. And in their latest report on these global trends, there is a really very striking sentence. I thought I would read it to you. In North America and Western and Eastern Europe, no country has advanced in democracy in the past 10 years, while Hungary, Poland, Serbia, Slovenia, and the United States of America have declined substantially, end quote. So according to these findings, liberal democracy has been backsliding, as we say, for most of the 21st century. So one of the things I thought we could talk about and explore together is this question of what explains that? What explains this polarization? What explains democratic backsliding? And generally speaking, as I see it, there are two general descriptions. And if you wish, I could go ahead and continue to describe that. Two explanations as to what causes this polarization or this backsliding. Right now, the dominant explanation, again, at least in the United States, but I think also that's true here in Europe as well, is that the polarization is an effect of social media. It's a social technologies effect. And the argument has been aired and discussed in various places recently because of a Facebook whistleblower named Frances Hagen. She's given testimony before the U.S. Congress, also in the U.K. At the EU, Brussels, that suggests that the nature of the problem has to do with the business model used by Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and that business model tends to emphasize content that holds viewers' attention, holds users' attention. The supposition is that the nature of that content needs to, as I say, hold attention, and the way in which that is done is by each iteration, each turn, the algorithms feeds ever more extreme versions of whatever it is you're looking at. So, for example, and I just mean to describe this. I'm not describing a particular case, though I'm quite confident we could find these. Say one might be interested in looking at healthy diets, and you ask YouTube for videos about healthy diets. If you just allow the recommendation algorithm to unfold within a very relatively brief period of time, the recommendation algorithm where you begin with a question about healthy diets or healthier living will soon take you into anti-vaxxer territory or into alternative medicines or into Robert Kennedy Jr. kinds of anti-vaxxer stuff, one of the principal anti-vaxxers in the United States. In those instances, the algorithm has produced content that will, according to this model, lead viewers ever deeper, as we sometimes say metaphorically, down the rabbit hole, Alice in Wonderland stuff, meaning that through just allowing the algorithms to do what algorithms do on social media platforms, we are exposed ever more to greater degrees of extremist content. The result of that is a radicalized population, people who spend their time on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, especially those who perhaps do not have the benefit of a lot of time doing reading of actual science, will end up becoming radicalized because of what they're seeing on these platforms. That's the first model. It's true. I don't mean to say that it isn't true, but there are those, and this is what I'm sort of focusing on here in Helsinki, there are problems with that description. One of the problems is, and perhaps this in some way is the principal problem, it understands polarization as being solely the source of technology. There's a cultural habit, at least amongst Americans. We love our gadgets. We love our iPhones. We love, these platforms that we're talking about are American creations in part. We have a cultural tendency to look for technology as a source of explanation or solutions for everything. And as a result of that, we tend to downplay or put in the background alternative explanations. So if the question that's before us is what causes polarization, if you answer, well, it's technology, what you're doing in the process is backgrounding or foregrounding, not foregrounding, backgrounding, alternative explanations. What about systematic racism over decades? Might that be a source of polarization? Might polarization come from the habit of American police of shooting unarmed black men? That's a source of polarization. What about extremes of wealth? Very rich people and a lot of very poor people who do not have the benefit of a social safety net. We don't live in a welfare state. Health care can bankrupt people if they don't have sufficient insurance, and even if you do have sufficient insurance, you can be bankrupt. So, there are a lot of social, economic, and political factors that are historical that one could turn to and say, that's a pretty good reason for polarization. And here's the problem. If you focus on technology and not social conditions as the source of polarization, you will put all of your eggs in one basket. In other words, you will see that all of the best solutions are found in addressing the problem as a technological problem. And that may be in part very beneficial. I don't mean to say that there isn't room for us to address some of the problems with those algorithms that accentuate extremism. There is. But if we look at technology as a solution, it produces unintended consequences. Among them being that we think that all we have to do is find the right AI, artificial intelligence system, to identify and pull out hate speech on Facebook or Twitter. Well, even if that were possible, and it turns out it doesn't seem to be as possible as Mark Zuckerberg had earlier said it was, again, according to Frances Hagan's testimony, she argued that only a small percentage of the hate speech on Facebook is actually identified algorithmically through AI. There is a problem there in that most of Facebook's budget for using AI as a solution to this problem focuses on the United States and on English. It leaves untouched Finnish, Swedish, the 120 plus languages, official languages of India. It leaves untouched the plethora of languages found in Africa. And if we pause for a second and realize that for many people in Africa, Facebook is their principal experience of the internet, then we find that this idea that content can be moderated, that conversations can be tamed solely by looking to technical solutions means that even if that's feasible, it's going to be feasible for English speakers in developed countries. It's going to leave behind some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. Myanmar, for instance, which has been understood to have had a genocide because of the hate that was generated on Facebook. So that's one of the problems with focusing solely on the social media platforms as a solution, or on technology as a solution. We leave also, obviously, we leave unattended some of these alternative explanations, like the other sources of polarization and social division that's found. So if maybe one thing to do would be for me to take a pause here for a second and have an opportunity to catch our breath and to think about this. But let me just simply say right now that if we think about the cause of polarization, it is not inaccurate to call our attention to the platforms, but at the same time, what we must be sure to do is to not lose sight of the social, political, historical factors that also play a role. And if we do that, we need to also spend time looking at things such as systematic racism, economic inequality, misogynistic policies having to do with the treatment of women in the workplace and in the world. These are also other factors that have an effect on how stable a liberal democracy is moving forward. So that's something about opening, treatment that I can share with you. And perhaps one of the things that we could do is just take a moment to explore some of these ideas in greater depth as we continue in the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Livingston. I think you made a very elegant argument here, and you framed it in relative terms. You did not want to dismiss the role of social media in polarization, but kind of focused your attention on the overemphasis of technological solutions that this attention to social media might trigger, and that sounds very lucrative. I was gonna perhaps. That got me thinking of why we are also here in the European context very much looking at the social media and at the technology, why it fascinates us so much as an explanation to these kinds of huge political events and drivers that can be really like you mentioned, centuries old, very divisive practices and social habits. One of them would be, I mean, just according to common sense of a 42-year-old person like myself, is that the change has been so quick and so huge in scope. Like I remember in the early 80s, growing up in northern part of Helsinki, nobody had a computer at home. That didn't kind of exist in our lives. Whereas now, I'm not sure about the actual statistics, but I think that average Finnish person spends about 3 hours a day with his or her mobile phone. So in a bit more than one generation time, technology has kind of revolutionized our everyday practice, and I guess that might be one reason why we are drawn to technological explanations and perhaps also overemphasizing the solutions in that field. I was also thinking about a guy in Paris in late 60s, Guy Debord, who was a kind of, at that era, he was the most radical of the radicals. He wanted to be the real, like he was throwing bricks at the police, and he was with the situationists. He was like the real, like eccentric French radical, and he introduced the idea that cultural industry in capitalism had commodified personal relationships, and that was supposed to be an extremely like out there radical claim of these young brick throwing rebels. But now, some 60 years later, this insight seems like a common knowledge. It's like, of course, social media has made our behavior embed a concrete means of value production, collecting and selling data. And it also frames human interaction in terms of this cultural industry, turns people into storytellers and brands, and it makes us follow these the value of these commodities and these narratives in very precise metrics, which makes us then behave in certain ways, guiding our expression. And these kind of, I think, huge changes that go beyond the technology, but also very much into self-expression and culture, might be some of the underlying factors why we are so fascinated with social media and its perhaps its effect on democracy. Do you think these kinds of this makes sense, that it's the technological the scale of the technological revolution kind of that triggers these simplistic solutions?
Yeah, that's great observations. Thank you for that. Couple of thoughts that come to mind. It was a very rich question and commentary. One thing about the nature of that change that has occurred, I have 2 points. Number one, part of the consequence of the nature of the now ubiquity, the everywhere sense of sensors of one sort or another in the room where we are sitting is casually looking around. It's a room filled with sensors. This is a sensor. The camera is, our phones are, we live in a world that's connected. And that connection, though, produces unintended consequences. We thought, early on, Mark Zuckerberg wanted to connect the world, and we'll just all have a kumbaya moment, and it will be sort of like an old Coca-Cola commercial, "We are the world." Well, it turns out the world has disagreements, and that conversation has ended up being unpleasant in many instances. So one of the effects, let me put that point differently, one of the effects of the ubiquitous nature of communications technology is the old institutional mechanisms for gatekeeping ideas, of demanding that ideas meet a certain threshold, a certain standard, a factual base is gone. We have a proliferation not only of sensors, but of channels, of communication channels. If you don't like what you're seeing on in one Facebook group, you can join another Facebook group that will have a definition of itself rooted in a particular Weltanschauung, a particular worldview, a particular sense of what is true and what is not. So the standard of truth has changed. Now, the old criticism is that world of gatekeeping was restrictive, that it was only a particular bourgeois upper middle class view of the world, that it actually made its way into public discourse. Now some of those critics, I suppose I would be one of them, that used to criticize that. I wrote a book several years ago called When the Press Fails. That was a critique of the nature of standard media gatekeeping. Now we find ourselves sometimes longing for those days, because of QAnon, because of anti-vaxxers, all of the factually unsound claims that are carried on those platforms. So that's my first response to what you said. But you also made an interesting point about well, at least I interpreted it as being about, the commoditization of not just our relationships, but of our identity, of who we are. There's a really interesting author who writes really long books, Shoshana Zuboff, in a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It is one of those landmark books that comes along every once in a while. Zuboff is a business professor at Harvard. And The Age of Surveillance Capitalism has, I think, a fairly straightforward argument. And she uses a lot of technical terms, a lot of jargon that we can avoid here. And let me try to distill the argument into its simplest terms. Facebook is free to us. Twitter is free to us in a sense in that you don't have annual membership fees, nothing like that. They don't make their money. The platforms don't make their money through membership fees, subscription fees. The way they make their money is as follows. All of those clicks, all of those likes, all of those forwards, all of those comments, the amount of time our mouse lingers over something, our computer mouse, the cursor, all of these signals that we give off when we're interacting with content on a social media platform, that's a raw material. Not only that, the fact that we walk around with our cell phones, that even when it's turned off, if you have an iPhone anyway, even when turned off, it's still communicating with towers, which gives off data that says we were in this place at this time and we have a pattern to our movement. Though that's also data. Those experiences, our experience of being on a social media platform or walking around or engaging with commercial activities, all of that is the raw material, Zuboff says, that is mined. It's like an extractive industry. Twitter and Facebook are like mining companies, but they're not mining ore, they're mining your experience. And they take those data, digital exhaust is sometimes referred to, and apply complex mathematical modeling to it to come up with predictive modeling of how you're going to behave tomorrow, including what you are likely to want to buy, what you are likely to want to, some sort of service you're likely to want to engage. So those predictive models then become the thing that the social media platforms sell to other corporations as an advertising or marketing product. And that's how Zuckerberg has become a billionaire. It's how Google has become a billionaire, by this extraction of our personal experience, our behavior. Zuboff calls it behavioral surplus. That is the way in which the platforms make their money. But what that means is that, number one, it means that it like any extractive industry, it needs raw material. Its raw material is you engaging with its platform, which goes back to what I said at the beginning of our conversation. They need to find content that's going to hold our attention. And as it turns out, we human beings tend to want to be engaged with content that excites us in some way. And unfortunately, one of the ways in which we're most clearly excited is by being angry, by being offended, by being upset with issues, the feeling of threat. If we can be convinced that we are somehow threatened by a group, an idea of some sort, we're going to pay attention to that, because after all, we're wired to think about our survival in terms of meeting threats. So that is this behavioral surplus extraction is the engine that is said to rest behind the algorithmic amplification of hate that leads to polarization that undermines liberal democracy.
It's a must read. I've just been afraid.
600 pages of it.
Yeah, I've been afraid of the Zuboff book for that particular reason. I was thinking what you mentioned. I think this is actually where the situation we're in now is pretty exceptional, because we are actually talking to microphones like this, and we are being filmed, and we know this at all times. So right. We cannot. So yeah, it's all out in the open. Right. For this half an hour that we're chatting here.
But could I interrupt you to
Sure.
say, if you have smart speakers, whether they're provided to you by Amazon or wherever, I mean, you say, "Hey Siri," or whatever the word is, that presumably activates the AI to pay attention to what you're saying. I don't know this, but there's always the lingering concern that smart speakers are a constant source of behavioral surplus.
Yeah. Aren't these the kind of things that if one had floated this around 10 years or 15 years ago, people would think that we're paranoid or like somebody's listening? Now it's almost, I wouldn't say accepted, but it's being, I mean, if you go nowadays in Washington to a high-level meeting, they ask you to leave your phone somewhere. And so it's, it seems it's, well, almost, well, not common knowledge, but almost somewhere there. You referred to this. I think some media scholars talk about sticky content that somehow excites us and makes us emotional and unfortunately angry, and that's one of the downsides of conversation in social media circles. I would like to ask you. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years about the bubbles, bubble as a metaphor of social media polarization, and I think that more often than not, when you do actual research on that, you find that not all that many people are actually insulated in a total bubble, but actually you can see some research that says that people use media even surf the web more freely than in the days of gatekeeping and one or two newspapers that one used to read. So there is that counter argument. I sometimes think that counter argument also has weaknesses, because if it is true that the social media communication makes our discussion more sharp and divisive, that kind of doesn't require us to be in kind of total bubbles, but it can still have adversary effects. What's your view on the bubbles issue?
Well, since we're giving out book references, that's Eli Pariser's book, The Filter Bubble.
Yeah, filter bubble.
And it's rooted in, first of all, an observation about the effect of algorithms. Resting behind that argument, though, if I remember from my reading of that book, he doesn't actually use this language all that much. I might be wrong in that. It's been a while. But there is a large body of social psychology literature and social science literature more generally that talks about two related phenomena that I think could be used to think about the claim about filter bubbles. And the reason why I want to draw our attention away from filter bubbles and to this other literature is because I think we're on firmer ground when we do that. There is, again, in social psychology, and it's been around for a long, long time, a concept called motivated reasoning. Leon Festinger, cognitive dissonance idea, right on forward, have talked about the fact that for most of us, we are inclined to two different inclinations. Sometimes we're motivated for accuracy goals. We want to be sure that we really understand what we're talking about. I'm motivated to make sure that if I'm given an opportunity like this, I'm not, I have my facts in a row, in order. Another motivation that we bring to our engagement with information is inclined towards fealty to an idea, an identity. It's motivated reasoning. Turn to sports. I don't like it when my favorite sports team loses. I tend to find all the reasons why cheating occurred or something like that. So these are the two motivations that we bring to our engagement with new information. And the question is, now going back to the idea of the internet, does the internet favor the inclination for accuracy, or does the internet engagement with information on the internet engage the inclination for motivated reasoning, for working hard to discount information that does not confirm our prior beliefs or to accentuate the acceptance of information that confirms it? Well, the answer isn't entirely clear. I mean, we can find, if we're so motivated, we can find a lot of factual information, but the argument would be that for some of us, it's the tendency of finding that favorite, Twitter personality or YouTube video star who tells us that what we believe is true. And if you think that that's a problem, then that is the nature of the filter bubble. If I could just add one more element, the term that's given to this inclination of finding things that confirm what we already believe is called selective exposure. So if you wanted to Google these ideas, the term is motivated reasoning, motivated cognition on the one hand, and the other is selective exposure. And if you were to Google those terms or Bing those terms, I don't have a favorite browser, you could find all of the reading you could ever want to have on those topics. It's a huge research literature.
According to an old joke, what's the most secure place to hide a body these days? And the answer is the second page of Google research. So nobody goes to the second page; it has to be on the first.
Which is, if I could interrupt, is important because you can game the algorithms that page ranking, right?
So, yeah, right. It's sure. It's very political in a direct sense. There's a lot of things I'd like to pick your brain on now, but you mentioned gatekeepers, and I think that's a very interesting issue also from a Finnish perspective, because Finland used to be an information kind of a gatekeeper society par excellence. We had one dominating newspaper. It's still quite dominating, but it used to really have a very strong presence in the news production, Helsingin Sanomat, and then one public news broadcast that was favored by everybody that started at 8:30. So the 8:30 starting public news broadcast and the morning Helsingin Sanomat really used to kind of almost dictate what we would talk over lunch in the offices of Helsinki and or over breakfast for that matter, and now that has of course changed a lot, and in a less extreme version, this is the fate of most journalistic media, that they had this gatekeeper status, and now they've lost it, and it's all much more relative. They are nodes in a network, important nodes, but still they are more actors in a network and not gatekeepers anymore. You've written about gatekeepers for quite a long time, as you noted. Do you have how do you see the role of journalistic media or legacy media in U.S. terms? How can they remain important in this erosion of institutions and the fall of their gatekeeping status?
Well, first of all, they still are and have been. So you have your examples here in Finland. In the United States, of course, it was the New York Times and the 3 broadcast networks. But I would have to say that at least in my early childhood, it was Walter Cronkite and CBS Evening News. In his role, Cronkite in 1972 was the most trusted man in America. He had a trustworthiness rating of 73% of the American public said that they trusted what Walter Cronkite said. No one comes close to that now. No one. And so, this is a really relevant point that you raise here. That said, if you were to look at some of the research that I've done with the Institute of Data, Democracy, and Politics, and certainly my colleagues, the data scientists, you would find that it's often the case that these legacy news organizations, especially now today, we would count CNN as a legacy organization. So CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, other newspapers like The Hill, which is a fairly conventional newspaper focused on Capitol Hill, that these are still agenda setters. I would switch terminology a little bit here. Not gatekeeping per se, but they set the agenda of the issues, the ideas, the conversations that are going to be on our minds, in our conversations, and before policymakers. And they still play that role. Interestingly enough, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, even still that play that role with these alternative far right platforms often, because what they do is they'll take that content from legacy newspapers or the investigations to use it as leverage for what we were talking about just a moment ago. They'll take what the Post is saying, say, for instance, about Donald Trump, the latest Donald Trump investigation or allegation about wrongdoing on the part of the Republicans, and they'll use that as a fuel for outrage, saying, see, here you go again, fake news, liberal agenda, out to destroy America. So the content, interestingly enough, it's not being treated in the same way as you and I were talking about, but it's still setting the conversation, but in a very different way. Let's stick with our pattern here of offering our viewers, our listeners, places to turn for thinking about this. It isn't an easy read. It will take some dedication. But Yochai Benkler, Ferris, and Roberts they're all Harvard-based data scientists and political scientists, have a book called Network Propaganda that was published a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, it's another fairly thick book. But what Benkler, or you could turn to the Disinformation Age, that edited volume we talked about. Benkler has a chapter that condenses the argument. Right. So what they found is that the pattern I've just described. You have an information ecosystem that consists of mostly news organizations in the United States that adhere to a standard that says we have to get the facts right. If you as a journalist or as an editor fail in that regard, you're fired. There are consequences to it. The 1/3 of the information ecosystem that's left is that what we were describing just a second ago, the far right, the Breitbarts and Daily Caller, others that are involved in outrage production. They don't adhere to that same standard. Their vetting is not about truth. It's about adherence to a ideology, a claim, a point of view, but they do that through a mechanism of generating outrage from the claims that are made by the Post, the Times, and mainstream news organizations.
It's a very interesting point that I think I've heard the term countermedia used sometimes in reference to these far right, often far right news medias. Which brings to my mind, you referred to standards of knowledge production in journalistic process, that it goes through a very different process than let's say non-journalistic media, call it counter media, alternative media, or fake news media. There's an interesting, I think, claim as well that we used to think the knowledge valued by populist movements in a bit maybe old-fashioned terms, that populist politics would kind of dismiss all kinds of knowledge production as such, as something that's alien to the common experience of a common man. That it's alienated elites have these statistics and different knowledge production institutes and all that, but they don't really talk to the common person that we represent as a sole voice. Whereas nowadays, the kind of the more maybe perhaps modern view of populism looks at the production of counter knowledge, which looks like journalism, or it looks like research. There's data, there's figures, and it doesn't really refer to let's say the experience of a common man or this earthly, more profound way of looking at the world than these cold statistics, but actually tries to present itself as very scientific and does not, if you wish, it doesn't step out of the rationalistic or the legacy of enlightenment, but actually tries to look like it, and this could be seen as perhaps a new development in the media sphere that also affects the state of play in the media world. But can I still ask you? do you see that these big media houses that have a journalistic way of producing information and the old heritage of legacy media, do you think they have to change their ways somehow to respond to the current polarization or digitalization, or are they actually still safe and sound and doing what they do best?
Yeah, well, your observation and your question are both really interesting, and if I can, I might want to try to tackle both here if we have the time. But let me draw your attention to a conversation that a NYU, New York University professor named Jay Rosen, a well-known media critic, has recently argued in a blog post of his. He has a well-known blog. He has argued that, in fact, mainstream journalism in the United States, anyway, today, can no longer afford to live in a world where they think that there are two sides to every story and that all they have to do is faithfully make sure that for every Republican they get a Democrat and the other way around. That it is his view that we have a very different environment in the United States right now. And this goes back to actually my opening quote. The United States, Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, and other countries, Turkey, India, certainly Russia, are either no longer liberal democracies, or they are crumbling liberal democracies. Well, Jay Rosen argues that the Republican Party in the United States has essentially given up on liberal democracy. It is a country in the grips of one major political party that has really sort of gotten on board with an authoritarian, Viktor Orban-like authoritarian project. So it is Jay Rosen's view that the mainstream media, the New York Times, the Post, the CNNs, have an obligation these days to a truth that is not rooted in simply dutifully reporting what a Republican tells them and having that juxtaposed to what a Democrat says, that the journalist needs to step in and be his or her own, how to describe this, sort of corrective mechanism. When Donald Trump, for instance, well, actually, this is probably for the most, this is a loaded example, and I acknowledge it. But when Donald Trump said, well, maybe we should explore the idea of using household disinfectant products as a source of combating coronavirus, right? Well, that was pushback against by most people. But let's go with less extreme examples of where, right now we are in the middle of an investigation of the January 6th insurrection. And the Republican Party is arguing that this is being exaggerated, that wasn't a big deal. Well, certainly it was. And if you were to follow the old convention of journalism, the New York Times and the Post reporters would simply have to say, and today Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House of Representatives, said, it's not a big deal. They have an obligation in their reporting to say, no, that was an insurrection. See, that's breaking out of that old mold that established the Post and the Times as a conventional professional news organization. They're there to report the facts, not interpret them. So Rosen believes this is the time. I hope Jay, if you're watching, I hope I'm doing a good job with your argument here. But others have made the similar argument that we need to now, even in conventional mainstream journalism, take a more active role at guarding the boundaries of what is true and what is not true. Otherwise, liberal democracy is going to simply collapse.
It's a very interesting point, and it also has a direct foreign policy dimension. I think there's been quite a lot of talk on how to respond to, let's say, claims of Russian president or Russian foreign minister when they are when they are plainly lying about something, about a security policy matter. It's very easy for journalists to fall into some kind of false balance because there's a long tradition in that, and
think about Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine, where no, we don't have any troops in eastern Ukraine. Of course not.
Yeah.
And yet, among other things, satellite imagery and on-the-ground video from all these ubiquitous sensors we were talking about earlier clearly showed the presence of Russian troops. They may not have had patches on,
Yeah.
but they spoke really quite eloquent Russian.
Yeah. And perhaps although Vladimir Putin has a poker face, maybe there was a little twinkle in his eye when he was reporting that of course not. Yeah. So it's a international issue definitely for journalism to think about the false balance and the ways to adapt into this world of algorithms and disinformation.
If I could, there was a second part of you led into your question with a really interesting observation, and that has to do with the idea that there are people in societies, whether it be Finland or the United States or elsewhere, that feel left out. The cultural elites in my country on the coast talk to one another. We have our view. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for 31 years. I'm from the Midwest, but I lived in Washington before D.C., and before that I was on the West Coast, in only my youth in the Midwest. So, my friends and family in the Midwest feel as though they've been neglected. They've been left behind. This goes back actually to the very first thing that I raised. I mean, the crisis of liberal democracy isn't merely a matter of algorithms. It's a matter of feeling disaffected. It's a matter of feeling left out by a system that's not paying attention to you anymore. I was born in a place called Flint, Michigan, which is famous because of its bad water and deindustrialization. A boyhood friend of mine, Michael Moore, somebody who grew up not far from me, is famous for making documentaries that talk about the plight of places like Flint, Michigan. Well, the alienation that's felt by people in Flint, Michigan comes not from the algorithms that they're engaging, but from the sense that the conversations that they could read about, if they did, in the New York Times and the Washington Post or on CNN aren't about them. It's about things and lives that are alien to them because their experience is one that's principally marked by the fact that their livelihoods have been taken from them by deindustrialization. So for them, there's that sense that the major newspapers that we talked about, the Post and the Times and others, are not about them. Secondly, there's been this other phenomena, corporate mergers of news organizations in the West generally, in the United States perhaps in particular, where local television stations, local newspapers have just disappeared. And the local television stations have been bought up by a handful of major corporations. Sinclair, for instance, is a very makes Fox News look liberal. Sinclair Broadcasting buys up local television stations, and then offers a common content to all of them, including a common editorial line that is pretty far right in most instances anyway. And so these people who are in places like Flint, Michigan, who feel as though they've been left behind, that they're not paid attention to, their local newspapers, the Flint Journal is barely holding on, it's just a little leaflet, are turning to then these conglomerate news organizations, if not online, for a worldview that tells them, yeah, you have been, and they are victims. They are victims in a sense that their jobs are no longer there. So in those instances, again, it goes back to what I said at the start. We need to look at real life stories to understand why people are angry and polarized. It's something more than simply the algorithms that reinforce that anger that comes from other places. That's the main theme of the research that I'm doing here in Finland.
I was actually going to return to this, which you commented so well in the very early on our discussion, and I'm glad you did it now. So there's still a little bit of time, and one thing I'd like to definitely ask you concerning this, if we want to call it alienation, or like disillusionment, or feelings of, if we don't have to use posh words, feelings of bitterness and anger in these like more peripheral regions, where probably Flint, Michigan is a famous example, but very similar sentiments can be seen and felt everywhere in the peripheral places of Finland, for example, and Europe. There's a lot of there's a lot of huge literature on the rise of identity politics, and then of course you have the more materialistic way of looking at things. So where would you place yourself? Do you think this situation is more due to lack of recognition or material decline? Cultural or material?
And we're going to handle that in our closing minutes here.
And you have to pick one, not the other, not both at all.
Binary choice.
Yeah.
No, that's not a binary. That question does not offer just a binary answer. I think that here's my answer, that's a false dichotomy. That culture is an expression of one's lived experience, and one's lived experience is the result of one's material resources. My cultural experience growing up as the son of an auto worker in Flint, Michigan, informs how I think about the world, but so too does the cultural legacy I have of PhDs and traveling the world. That also produces who I am. And I think that in various ways that's true of many of us, that we are not just one thing. We are not just an identity that's given to us by the happenstance of our physical makeup, nor are we solely the result of our material physical experience, but it's the combination of the two that produces who we are. Now, the question, though, becomes, in looking for solutions, do the policymakers pay more attention to culture or to material advantages and disadvantages? That becomes the interesting question. And it seems to me that right now in my country, the Biden administration is saying that what we need to do is do some basic things to help people with their material needs. I mean, we just signed an infrastructure bill that Congress did and the president did that will address some major material needs that are required to address the lived experience of people in the United States, no matter what their gender or their race.
Thank you. I think that was a prime example of how asking a silly question can produce an interesting answer. I think I should perhaps pursue a career in journalism at some point.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you so much. It also, your answer reminded me of some writings of Mark Lilla, who has written about his story of why the U.S. is so polarized, and he of course, as you would expect, also mixes the material and cultural explanations together, and emphasizes the role of suburbs, which is interesting because they are, of course, it's a very material thing, but it also
has racial overtones.
It has racial overtones. It has broken city communities and rural communities, and segregated way of living. Very much promotes individualistic or like family first kind of Reagan dispensation, as he calls it. But what would you pick as some of the? You don't have to pick a silver bullet that caused polarization, but some of the key developments, let's say in the 20th century, in the American or more broadly Western experience that have led us to polarization.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really interesting question, and what immediately comes to mind is neoliberalism or libertarian capitalism. It happened to be the case that just at the point in time when the Soviet Union collapsed and the shock doctrine and the introduction of quote-unquote liberal capitalism to Russia and the Eastern Bloc, it was actually an introduction to a particular kind of capitalism that was introduced not that far before that by Reagan and Thatcher and Milton Friedman, that said, well, capitalism must be unregulated. If one fails in this competitive marketplace, then that's your problem. No social safety net. If you want a service, you pay for it. So therefore, my university in Washington, D.C. costs over $70,000 US a year to attend. That means that, you end up with extreme economic inequalities, but also inequalities of opportunities for things like education, healthcare, and decent living. All of that has become so cutthroat that it has led, I think, to the kinds of alienation that we're seeing. There is these days a growing literature of people who are saying that liberalism is dead. Liberalism, that Enlightenment project that emerges out of the Protestant Reformation and gave rise to democracies, liberal democracies, individual rights, human rights. Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. The presumption in the title is it has failed. He says the reason it has failed is because his understanding of liberal capitalism, and capitalism is a part of liberalism, has produced all of these terrible outcomes: alienation, lack of community, a lack of sense of community. And he and others on the cultural right in American politics are saying it's time to leave liberalism behind. A Yale historian and law professor named Sam Moyn, who, by the way, is going to be here in Helsinki in March, Sam Moyn has made the argument that says, no, what all of these critics are confusing is they're confusing liberalism or they're confusing neoliberalism for liberalism, that it's actually neoliberalism that has produced this sense of no belonging, no community, no sense of anyone caring about us because the economy is so cutthroat. And I think that's an interesting point, and I think that Moyn is correct.
Yeah, it sounds to me that sometimes liberalism is used in a far too broad sense, and it's equated with capitalism and colonialism and everything bad in Western development. The sins, the black book of liberalism. One should be maybe careful in what we mean with liberalism. Interesting. From neoliberalism, I'd still like to ask a more specific question that might not lead to anywhere, but you published this edited volume, The Age of Disinformation, in 2019, and that was right before pandemic. Has COVID-19 changed your way of thinking disinformation, or has it just reinforced your kind of that I called it already?
Yeah, no, I think in my experience, you would have to ask my co-editor, Lance Bennett, what his view is, but I think that what the pandemic has done for us is really bring out in stark relief some of the things that we claimed in that book. The basic claim in that book is that disinformation finds a home in spaces where people no longer have faith and confidence in authoritative institutions. Let me put that less abstractly. In a situation where people no longer believe in science, no longer believe in mainstream media, no longer believe in scholars and academics. Because why? Because in part they've been told for decades by neoliberals that you can't trust science because it tells us the climate is warming, and we all know it's not, right? And they made that claim for their own financial interests because they were in extractive industries. So part of this answer is that for the longest time, a lot of people, at least a lot of Americans, were told to not have faith in those authoritative institutions. Don't believe in science. Those are the very people who are not being inoculated, who are not trusting mask mandates. Not because they are somehow, evil people, but rather they simply do not have faith anymore in authoritative institutions, which drives us back to that original point that I raised. Yeah. How do you understand that phenomenon of people losing faith in core institutions of their society? We no longer have Walter Cronkites and CBS Evening News. We no longer have the mainstream news organizations in Finland or elsewhere. What explains that?
I'm too young to remember Walter Cronkite as a authoritative.
Me too.
Figure. Yeah. But I was just last night. I was watching a documentary on Miles Davis, and he was there introducing Miles Davis as this new bebop era cool guy and a genius. And yeah, I noticed that he has a great standing in American political history. I was going to ask, perhaps this is my final question, and again, I'm trying to make it sound not too silly, but it might be a bit of a silly question concerning technology. I mean, if we take a broad view of technology, of course, I'm talking about digitalization and social media now in this context. But there's this conventional kind of optimism when there's a new innovation that we have this innovation, it brings out something new, and then we have problems, unintended consequences, as you mentioned, and then we learn to use it. And this learning can take place in individual level, like better media consciousness, better media literacy, or on the more public level than with regulation. We can react to it also as political community, and then we learn to use it. It kind of reminds me of industrialization, how there was this historians of ideas talk about Engels' pause, that when industrialization hit England in the late 18th century, there was almost a 50 years break before the conditions of the workers started getting better, and the fruits, let's say, of the innovation started to spread in the society more. Do you agree to this kind of, let's say, conventional optimistic view about technology, or are you more pessimistic about technological changes?
I'm not a technological determinist, which I signaled at the very beginning of my talk, that we need to understand that technologies are used in a social context. Mm. And if that's true, then a technology, there's actually a term given to this idea. Technologies offer not a deterministic outcome, but affordances. Mm. An affordance is something taken, very finished, it's taken from design. That door handle that I'm looking at over there is designed for the purpose of opening and closing that door, but we humans will use that technology in innovative ways that are not determined necessarily by its original intent. I can use it as a coat hanger. Mm. I can use it as a particularly fiendish parent to help extract a tooth by tying a string on a loose tooth and closing the door. There are all kinds of ways, in other words, in which we use technologies that are unexpected. And so that means that, to answer your question, don't look to the inherent qualities of the technology, but rather to the ingenuity of the humans who are using it. We have to remember that for much of its history, the first half of its history, social media platforms were liberation technology. They're going to bring a new day of dawning democracy to the world, and authoritarian regimes were going to fall. That's not a view heard very often anymore. So what has changed? The technologies haven't changed. It's our sense of the intention of the humans using them that's changed. So keep your eye on the intentions of the users. In part, what they can do is shaped by the affordances of technology, but the intentions are just equally as important.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's been a lovely chat, and I think it's time for us to call it a day. Your book has been now mentioned a couple of times, and I will sure to read it and then follow the paths it will take us from there on. Thank you one more time.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your attention.